Welcome to the Dr. Broadway Podcast, the theater history podcast where a couple of doctors sit around and talk about Broadway. I am your co-host, Dr. Kristin Stultz Pressley, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Tracey Brent-Chessum. Tracey, tell us what we're going to talk about today.
All right, so this is our second timeline episode. So today we're going from Oklahoma to the early 2000s-esque. We'll go from kind of Oklahoma to Wicked and maybe a little beyond. As we did in our last episode, you can find this timeline kind of filled out on the Dr. Broadway website if you want to see kind of where we're going. So that is what we are doing. We're going to start with Oklahoma and move on from there.
I love it. Let's do it. So we're looking at, if you're a numbers person, we're looking at roughly 1943 to, if we stop at Wicked, 2003. Mm-hmm. So that's a really manageable 60-year time period. And as Tracey alluded to at the end of our last episode, she was trying to go 300 years in that episode. So 60 seems like a little bit more manageable time frame.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about Oklahoma. We've talked about why it's so significant in that 1943 moment. We've also talked a little bit about kind of why we talk about everything before Oklahoma and why we talk about everything after Oklahoma. Oklahoma really sets up kind of a cookie cutter, economic and artistic brainchild for musical theater to follow from here on out. And we've done that in another episode. So we won't spend too much time on Oklahoma. But that's where it starts. Oklahoma, well, what happens directly after Oklahoma? Oklahoma is a huge success, as you know. And so what do we see happening next? Well, we see a rash of musicals, actually quite a bit of building of musicals, that are all built kind of on the same template. And a lot of historians call this Broadway's golden age, right? And so what you're doing is you're seeing lots and lots of musicals that are, have that integrated storyline. They are using naturalistic acting. They're using time and place to kind of inform the elements of the script and the score and things like that. It's really kind of funny. I look at this time period directly after Oklahoma, and I tend to teach it this way, and I call them the cookie cutter classics because they're basically Oklahoma in a different setting. So if you look at Brigadoon, we have Oklahoma in Scotland. And if you have, but seriously, you look at
I'm not disagreeing. I've just never thought of it that way.
Well, if you look at so many of these that are coming out, Brigadoon, Guys and Dolls, Oklahoma and New York, Music Man, Oklahoma and Iowa, Annie Get Your Gun, Oklahoma and South Dakota, or wherever it is that they are. You see these things happening over and over, and it's not just by the same composers. Rodgers and Hammerstein, The King and I built very much on the same kind of template. Are they doing wildly massive new things with The King and I? Yes, in social commentary, but it's still built on the same kind of same kind of template. But it's not just Rodgers and Hammerstein that's doing this. Mm-hmm. We have kind of this new rash of golden age composers like Irving Berlin and Lerner and Loewe. Cole Porter's still in the mix, even though he's kind of on his way out. But he still has Kiss Me Kate to kind of Frank Loesser.
Yeah, which, by the way, one that was the first musical to win a Tony Award for Best Musical was Kiss Me Kate.
Amazing. Right?
So, so he's been around in the mix. I think what's important to note here is, and we may have discussed it, I don't remember. I definitely thought it in the last episode, the previous timeline episode, is the impact that makes money, I'm going to do that does, right? Mm-hmm. If that sells a whole bunch of tickets, then let me try that so I can sell a whole bunch of tickets. Mm-hmm. So not only is there this artistic impulse of, let's follow in this great form that is being developed, but there's also that ran for a really long time. That ran for a lot longer than Anything Goes did. Let's try this,
Yeah. Well, and it's like you also if you look at Oklahoma and you think back to that episode, it's, it's that commercial template that's so important. It's the making of the the cast recording, not just the sheet music. It's making sure that it's on the radio as well as it's on, and you can get it on the records, and you can get it, and that is what ends up making a lot of money to then push people into buying tickets as it goes through. And there was they did such a beautiful job of making sure it was financially viable. So why would you monkey with it? If it was actually making money, finally, after 1929 and how hard it was in the 30s, don't monkey with it. And so that's, I tend to teach them as cookie cutter classics. And it's funny because I didn't get an undergrad intro to musical theater history. Honestly, I don't think I've ever actually taken a musical theater history class. This is all because they didn't have them when I went to school.
Right.
But I got a book by Alan J. Lerner.
Yes.
Right? And he was writing the history of Broadway.
Is it called like The Musical or something? Because I think I have the same book.
Yeah, exactly.
I have the same
and that
book.
Was my first first introduction to it. And I remember looking at this and I'm like, okay, so basically you have a classic musical and then you have cookie cutters after it. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what, I was like, okay, I see this. This is what it is. And so in trying to piece this together in my mind, because that's what we do as historians. We just try to find some sort of pattern, right?
Yeah.
That's what this kind of looked like. And it's kind of helpful,
It is really helpful. And I've never thought about it in that way. But when you have that kind of paradigm, you can apply it to several different epics, right? Mm-hmm. You can look at, like we talked about in the last timeline episode, how so many of those writers were following, they were trying to be cut from the same cloth as Gilbert and Sullivan and Jacques Offenbach. And they were trying to do what they did because that had worked. So let's do that. And that really but then again, you see like the mega musicals. Oh, so we're doing lots of technology and we're doing huge cast and big synth music and all of that. That worked for them. Let's do it for us. So you see that repeated over and over and over again. So it's a really helpful paradigm to think about. Mm-hmm. And when you think in those terms of cookie cutter and then, this is the cloth and we're all cut from that same cloth. When you think in terms of that, it does help you to see what are the real turning point musicals, which ones changed the cloth that we're all cut from, right?
Exactly.
And that's really a helpful paradigm.
I think it's a good kind of transition. We'll do individual episodes about all of these because they're still around. They're still touring. We still love them. But the thing that they are doing is they are perfecting, right? They're making them tighter.
Yes.
They're doing way new things with social commentary. They're pushing the boundaries during this time, and they're learning what works and what doesn't, and what they have to fix. So much so that in the 50s, we're getting Oscar Hammerstein is putting "you have to be carefully taught to hate."
Right.
Into it. And there's so much. You can do an entire episode on just that one song. Yeah. And the impact it has on American society at large. Because not only is he putting it out into the world, he's going on the equivalent of today's Letterman. Oh, I guess Letterman isn't on anymore. I am so behind the times. So let's just talk about that.
I think we're just old. I think that's the thing.
They're going on the late night TV shows and introducing them that way to a generation of people who don't know musical theater.
Right.
And it's like, look, this is something we have to deal with as a society. So they're pushing and they're pushing and they're pushing. This is where we get into a little bit of controversy, because I look at this as, the cookie cutter classics. When do they start changing? When does it start and it stop? Most people will tell you that the golden age, and we came up with this on, I think, the very first episode, goes all the way into Hair. Yeah. And I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think there's so much innovation and so much change in what the musical is trying to do later on. And when I look at kind of the golden age, or that cookie cutter classic age, I put it from Oklahoma to West Side Story. And the reason why is because in 1959, 57?
I think it was 59.
I think it's 59, yeah. If you get to 1959, everything in front of that, all kind of, they're all trying to do different things. West Side Story is a behemoth. It is the integrated musical.
Right.
I don't think we'd seen anything like it ever. And still, every time I come back to West Side Story, the dance finally tells a story within the music, within the drama.
Hmm.
It's not just a ballet that we have.
Right.
What does
Right.
this ballet have to do with
Yeah.
the play? You know,
Right.
she
Yeah.
always said. It just kind of cracks me up that they're finally like the movement becomes part of the characterization, becomes part of
Yeah.
like it's fully integrated, and it's like we finally figured out what to do with dance. Like we finally figured out how to make it work
Yeah.
perfectly. And that kind of pushes us into the 1960s. And so I cap it there because what happens after, I think, is fundamentally different because they're not trying to make, the perfect musical anymore. I think that a lot of performers after seeing West Side Story went, well, I can't do that.
Right. It's been
I mean,
done.
it's like, okay, like that's a lot of work and a lot of
Yeah.
thought, and there's so much into it that we're still like talking about it today. What do we have to say, and how are we going to impact Broadway in our own way or whatever? It also kind of introduces us to Sondheim, but
Yes.
so 1959, I look at that as like the perfect integrated musical, and then after that, I can't come up with a better title, but it's like musicals as a source of social discussion because everything after that is talking about our like life that we're sitting in and what has actually happened over the last 20 years that we've been ignoring while we've been trying to deal with our PTSD, which is totally normal and rational, by the way. Like a generation of men come back for more and they're like,
Yeah.
please, I would like I would like Oklahoma, yes. That's what I need. I need that. I need the Music Man. That's the kind of stuff that I need. Even the Sound of Music is a little too close to home,
Right.
But then after that, we have to start unpacking everything that we haven't been talking about for the past 20 years while we've been trying to kind of heal some wounds. And I think that goes along with American history. I mean, if you really look at kind of the setup of the generations and how the generations worked, and that they weren't the greatest generation. They're the next one. I think they call it the silent generation, right? And before they have the baby boomers,
Yeah.
that they all came home and had 2.6 kids, like every single
Yeah.
last one of them. Obviously,
Yes. Right.
they are all still working today.
Yes.
like all of
Yes.
these people.
Exactly.
But when you get into the 60s and you get, things like MAME and you get specifically to Fiddler on the Roof where, 1964 and the Civil Rights Act that is being built around that time.
Yeah.
We're starting to understand that we as musical theater artists, as an artistic genre, whatever it is, like we have power to impact and discuss what's happening around us.
Yeah.
And that's the product of that social commentary that, I give Oscar Hammerstein the credit for that, really building that up and saying these things can sell things. It's not just I can sell products, which we can. We all know that. We've seen that. We can sell ideology. We can sell social responsibility in some ways.
Yeah. And also the infrastructure that was not in place that we talked about in the last episode, the infrastructure that was not in place for this conversation between audience and show was suddenly in place. Not only do we have sheet music, but we have records, we have cast recordings, we have radio airplay, we have television shows, like you mentioned, Oscar Hammerstein going and talking to I saw a great interview for some research I was doing with Mike Wallace. Is it Mike Wallace? I know his son, Chris. So Mike Wallace, the dad,
Yeah.
Mike Wallace, a great interview with Oscar Hammerstein and Mike Wallace, and right after the premiere of South Pacific, where he's talking about
Yeah.
that. So we have the infrastructure for this to be a two-way conversation instead of it to just be, oh, this show got on a train and it went across the country and we don't know what people thought because we had no means of having a dialogue. And now there is a way that the consumer can kind of have a richer experience, understand more of what the creator of the show was trying to do. They can interact with that in a number of different ways. And so that really begins to change things. Something that you mentioned, I love I totally hear your point about West Side Story being the perfection of what Oklahoma was attempting to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I absolutely see your rationale for stopping the golden age there. I think that, and I am not at all married to hair. It's always what I was taught, but I'm
Yeah.
not married to it and it for any reason. But when you think about it, I guess you can see, if you're thinking about it in terms of a narrative arc, you can see Oklahoma as the inciting incident, or maybe you even
Yes.
go back to Showboat as an inciting incident. But if we're,
Mm-hmm.
we'll start with Oklahoma. Oklahoma is what starts it. It builds and builds and builds and builds and builds, and we have shows like South Pacific and Annie
Mm-hmm.
Get Your Gun and all of those shows. Most of them written by Roger Hammerstein, not Annie Get Your Gun, but many of the others. And we build, and then ultimately we get to the pinnacle, which is West Side Story. And then there's falling, and the falling isn't that we're going backwards. The falling is that we're okay, that's the norm, and now we're going to break that norm in the
Mm-hmm.
same way Oklahoma broke the norms in 1943.
Yeah.
Right. And
And I
then
agree
what
with
we
that bit
say,
too.
we fall, 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 fall. And then we say, oh, hair, that's the one that really just blew us out of the water
Mm-hmm.
because all of those others had elements of Oklahoma. But hair was
Was
its own
completely
thing
different.
altogether.
Yeah.
So maybe maybe it's not linear like we tend to think of things, but it's more of a curve.
Mm-hmm.
That
And
might
I
be a better
mean,
way to think of it.
yeah, I mean, I don't. There's no one right way to think about it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. No, I agree.
I think that so often it's like I err on the side of there's something different happening here,
Yeah.
and there's something different happening here. For a long time, I said that I thought the golden age went all the way to Fiddler on the Roof,
Okay.
and that was that inciting moment of change, like
Yes.
massive change. Um, I think there's I just thought that it needed a warming up period.
Yeah.
You know, and
Makes
that's kind
perfect
of how I
sense.
look. That's kind of
Yeah.
how I look at those things. But I think
That
there's
makes
a
perfect
crisis
sense.
in 1964. If you look at Fiddler on the Roof and what's happening around this time in our culture, but there's this huge confusion over culture versus counterculture. The
Hmm.
cost of productions has skyrocketed all of a sudden.
Yes.
The
Yes.
age of the audience has, like, the people that were going to see these shows all the time are now starting to age out because they are passing on.
Yeah.
So now we need to engage a new audience. We don't know how to do that. We've seen that crisis in our own lives, like in theater
Absolutely.
today too. Most of the great composers are dead. Like at this point, they spent their life, they created something, they got to live it for the last little bit, and then a lot of
Yeah.
them are starting to die.
Well, and
And
they're
most
either
of the rest of
dead. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think this is an important only because, we talked about John Philip Sousa was your bread and butter. Dorothy Fields is mine.
yes,
And she was a songwriter who worked from 1924 until her death in 1974. And what was different about Dorothy Fields was she was working with and at the same level as Rodgers and Hammerstein and
mm-hmm.
Cole Porter and all of those people, many of whom she collaborated with. But the difference between her and them was that, yes, some of them died. Cole Porter died. Um,
Hammerstein.
George Gershwin obviously died in 1937.
Yeah.
Oscar Hammerstein died, but others of them survived and just couldn't change what they were doing.
Yes.
And so there's this heartbreaking quote that Irving Berlin said to a historian, I think in the early 70s, he said it. He was interviewed and he said, it was like the whole world changed and nobody wanted to buy what I was selling.
Yeah.
And so some of them didn't die. They just couldn't artistically change their way
Mm-hmm.
of operating, which makes the work of Dorothy Fields, which I won't spend hours talking about, though I want to, but it makes it all the more incredible because where so many Irving Berlin was saying, I can't do this anymore, I'm going to retire and be a recluse.
Yes.
Dorothy Fields said, oh, I think I'll write with Cy Coleman now, who was, 30 years
Mm-hmm.
younger than her and writing a completely different style of music than she'd
Yes.
ever written with Sweet Charity. And she's like, I'm going to find a way to make myself
Mm-hmm.
relevant in every era. And a lot of those Golden Age songwriters could
Didn't.
not find a way to do that or would not find a way to do that.
No, and you're absolutely right. That's was my next point is that a
Yeah.
whole bunch of the talent either they died or they went to the West Coast because the West Coast was actually film was putting all of the cookie cutter classics on film in the
Right.
early 60s.
Right.
So it was like, okay, I'm going to go and get work out there.
Yeah.
And I think you're very right. It's like they couldn't change because they're like, but I finally found something that works. I don't
Yeah.
want to change what I'm doing. The producers
Right.
felt like that too, because
Yeah.
the producers finally had,
A
like, I
formula.
know how this works, but
Yeah.
they didn't want to take chances on new forms or ideas. The economics didn't work in their head. All of a sudden, we're starting to get electronic instrumentation. We don't know what to do about that. We've
Hmm.
been doing full orchestras in the pit at this point. We're not using electronic, like, sound systems. We're not doing it, like, all of that stuff comes later, and it's like they don't want to update anything.
Right.
And
Great point.
so the other thing is that in the 60s, by 1960, we are so out of touch with what America is doing musically. It's
Yeah.
hilarious.
Yeah.
I mean, if you put Broadway, now we look at Broadway and they're like, oh my gosh, so iconic, has lasted the test of time. But in the 60s, it was like, that was my dad's music. Like,
Exactly.
where are my electric guitars?
Exactly.
And, like,
But we don't have that, and we may have alluded to this in a previous discussion, and I've just forgotten. But what's important to remember is that for so much of the middle part of the 20th century, popular music came from Broadway, right?
yeah,
For so much of
it
it
was the
until
popular music.
that's exactly right. So we had kids and parents alike. There was just music. There
Hmm.
wasn't youth music and parent music. There was just music.
Everybody
And
standing
then
around the
when we
piano singing together.
Exactly, exactly. And then we get to, I'm gonna use Elvis Presley, even though he was certainly not the first, but he in our minds is the advent of rock and roll. But that movement of rock and roll that comes along in the late 1950s really begins to fracture what Americans are listening to. And
Hmm.
suddenly this kind of high art sound, which is ironic that it's now considered high
Howard, isn't
art,
that funny?
yeah,
It's
it
like,
comes from Broadway, and rock and roll is what the kids are listening to. And so we begin to see this fracture
hmm
in music, in
hmm
popular music. So that's important to understand too, because if you're just looking back, you think there's always been this youth music and adult music, right?
mm-mm,
That's
mm-hmm.
not the case. It once
No.
was one and the same.
And, it's partly because the older generation didn't, you know, didn't go along with the new music. They were like,
Right.
I'll stay with my old music. Thank you
Right.
very
And I
much.
think that probably a lot of the reasons why parents and grandparents were like, you're not going to listen to the devil's music or whatever they called it. I think a lot of those creators like Irving Berlin probably felt the same way. And they're
Yeah.
like, no, I'm not going to stand for this. I'm not going to be a part of this. And I think that it was that kind of get off my lawn curmudgeon
hmm
attitude that caused them to be no longer relevant. Um, and kind of put themselves out to pasture when they didn't. I mean, Dorothy Fields is a great example of they didn't have to be put out to pasture.
No.
They could have just rolled with the changes.
Yeah. And yeah, it just wasn't, it, it just kind of makes me, it makes me sad, because the other thing
Yeah.
that you realize is that they didn't do a good job. These are always things that I check off when I'm like, change, we're changing from one thing to another, and how that past genre is going to fare.
Yeah.
It's when we stop mentoring people, like when there's not a lot of mentees ready to
Yeah.
pick up the mantle. That's when I know, okay, something different is about to happen. And there's not, I mean, Stephen Sondheim
Yeah.
arguing. I keep Stephen Sondheim on his own rung on my timeline. I'm like, he doesn't do anything when like, he makes no sense. So just
Yeah.
put him over here because he's doing his own thing, because he's an
Yeah.
actual artist, and I don't know what the rest of us are doing. Just put him over there.
Yeah.
But, like, he's the only one that's like a carry over. Most of the people that are really going to succeed on Broadway in the 60s and 70s, and there's not a lot of them, are not people that you saw coming up through the ranks working with
Mm-mm.
other people. They're people
Mm-mm.
that are coming to and are learning by, like, listening and watching, figuring it out, and then reproducing, not because they
Yeah.
were part of a process. Which is why it's like, after Fiddler, I do think something completely changes here, because these musicals are protest in every form, from the dance styles to the music styles
Hmm.
to what we're talking about. But I mean, even How to Succeed in Business Without
I was
Really
going to bring that
Trying
one up. Yes.
is
Yes.
early. It's pretty early
Yeah.
in the
It was
60s. And it's,
1960, because it and Sound of Music shared the Tony, and it was the only time a musical has shared a Tony Award, but How to Succeed also won the Pulitzer.
Mm-hmm. But think about the music next
Yes,
to one another. It's totally different things.
totally. But even its content,
Mm-hmm.
all of those folks that went to fight the war came home and had their 2.5 kids and they're
Mm-hmm.
working in these jobs, and it's completely lampooning what has become the norm in
Yeah.
American life.
So, I mean, there's just something that's just, it's breaking here. But we see
Yeah.
that in America with just the generational change, right?
Yeah.
What I find after 64 and why I would probably include it all the way back to 59, but like these are musicals that are designed to be a vessel of social protest in some ways. They're doing it differently on purpose. And sometimes they're doing it differently on purpose for the sake of social commentary, and sometimes they're doing it to try to like punch the art form forward, whether that be
Well,
musicals or whatever.
and something that I think is part of this conversation, but not today. It's just something that I want to throw out there to say, let's
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge this and then maybe we'll unpack it later, is what's happening off Broadway. Like we
Oh.
see this emergent off Broadway explosion of countercultural theater taking place starting in the 40s and 50s, but really reaching fever pitch in the 60s. So suddenly there is not only infrastructure for people to interact with mainstream Broadway, but there's also infrastructure for people who are wanting to make avant-garde theater in the
Yeah.
United States.
And the
And
American
that
avant-garde
trickles.
theater, like,
Yeah.
if you put it next to what's happening on Broadway, I'd be like, my grandpa wants to see Broadway. He wants to see
Right.
Broadway.
Right,
like,
right.
this is
But I mean,
crazy stuff that they're doing.
yes, it's crazy stuff, but it's also who produces hair,
Mm-hmm.
public theater,
Mm-hmm.
and, becomes one of the, if not the flagship off-Broadway producer,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think you cannot look at this slow roll away from the traditional book integrated Rodgers and Hammerstein Oklahoma style musical without saying there was this percolating hotbed of
Mm-hmm.
artistic activity going on counterculturally off Broadway, off Broadway that didn't exist until the 1940s. And then that reaches its zenith with, oh,
Yeah.
suddenly off Broadway moves uptown by
Mm-hmm.
way of hair.
Yeah. Well, but you've also got cabaret too.
Yes,
That's
yes.
happening at the same time. But I mean, this is your step towards the concept musical.
Right, right.
I just want to read a list of shows and then we'll talk about cabaret. But it's like these are the shows kind of in this era where we've got How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Oliver, Hello Dolly, Funny Girl, Fiddler on the Roof, Man of La Mancha, Cabaret, Hair, 1776, which I think is a huge countercultural moment, even though most people don't. And then you go into Company. You start moving into the concept
It goes
musical, right?
wild. I mean, the Wild West in the 70s.
But it's
No
just
doubt about it.
it's just crazy. But if you look at Cabaret, yes, I do think this is like very much kind of our stepping stone into the concept musical, like actually being something that everybody was doing.
Totally agree.
But I mean, you think about the cabaret itself as a concept, like the cabaret where we're sitting in the cabaret.
Yes.
We are a character in this.
Immersive
and
theater.
we sat there in the audience. Like I've seen cabaret once and that's or twice. And I don't want to see it ever again.
I
Not
don't
because
like
I
it at
don't
all.
love it. No, it's not because I don't love it or because I don't want to support that, but because every time I sit through it, I'm like, this show is set up to make me passively not respond to the dangers of Nazism.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
it is indicting me
It's
for
very
sitting on my
difficult to
butt.
watch. It's difficult to watch. That's why I don't like it. Not that I don't like the music. I do. It's that
I
it's
know.
difficult to watch for the reasons you just described. Absolutely.
The audience is passive and being entertained
Yeah.
by that which they are supposed to hate.
Yeah.
You know? And I don't have that has no recollect. I don't see how that in any way, shape, or form fits anything like what we were doing in Oklahoma.
You're
That
totally
is
right.
a step forward.
Yeah.
So I
no
just kind
question.
of looked at this in its own way, and hair is not my favorite. It's not my favorite.
No.
But it's crazy. It's just so different. Again, it's like as cabaret, I feel like is still got one foot in in some of the musical theater tradition. I don't think Hair does. And it's like,
Yeah.
boom,
No,
you're right.
well, that's
It's
what
the
I say.
avant-garde that really kind of moves
Yes.
in.
It was that countercultural, like you got a form, we're gonna blow that form all the way up,
Hmm.
and that's what it did. But it gave permission to the shows that came after it to do some blowing up of its own,
Yeah.
um, in a mainstream context, right?
Yeah.
Because certainly there were crazy things happening off Broadway, but they hadn't gone mainstream. And when
Hmm.
Hair went mainstream, it gave permission. But I hear what you're saying and agree with you that Hair was not the first show to blow up certain parts of
Yeah.
that Rodgers and Hammerstein form.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'll give you that. It's like, well, this is the first time it wasn't like had no feet in the
Right.
tradition whatsoever.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's what's hard is like as a historian, that's still not very long ago for a historian. Like we're
Mm-mm.
still like
67.
trying
That was
to read
67.
to name like eras of
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
Usually it doesn't really solidify itself to much later.
Hundreds of years
So,
later. That's right.
like I look at right now and I'm like, okay, so I've got kind of two things on this timeline that we'll put on the website, but it's like I've got them as vessels of social discussion and protest musicals. They're probably all like not totally protest musical. There's something different happening in there, but I
Yeah.
don't know what to call it, right?
Right.
So it's a hard time. I just don't think it has anything to do with that golden age. So
No,
I
agreed.
think
Yeah.
it's a hard one. So there's a lot of different opinions on kind of what you do there. I think that's what's interesting. After Hair, what happens? We really get into what we call the concept musical.
Sondheim happens. That's
Yes,
what happens.
I know.
Hal
And
Prince and
Kristen
Stephen
and I
Sondheim.
have talked about concept musicals because people ask us what concept musicals are. And you're like, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm a golden age girly. Talk to Tracy.
I know, which is so funny because I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm like embedded in the 1880s. What are you talking about? But the concept musical, basically, where the show's statement or idea is more important than the storyline at large. Kristen and I had this entire discussion that you cannot explain the concept musical without having explained the Golden Age.
Yeah.
Like, it is almost impossible to unlink these two from each other, but they have to be taken together in order to understand them. Because if you don't understand that social commentary is introduced within that intercreated form, and then you look and say, okay, no, the form isn't as important as the statement. Like, those two things, it just, I don't understand how we even start to discuss the concept musical otherwise.
Yeah.
Other than just like, well, it is. It does go along with what we call in literature like deconstruction, right? Like the deconstruction of the text. It's very, very similar to what we're doing in kind of the literary world, but it's different and it's hard. It's still hard to do.
Yeah, and I enjoy a lot of what we would consider concept musicals. Company is one of my favorite shows of all time. I love it. I don't fully understand what the heck it's doing, but I love that show. But also I joked about it, Sondheim and Hal Prince, who, Hal Prince, we've probably mentioned, a great director, won more Tony Awards than any other person on the planet, even Audra McDonald, if you can believe that. He's got 21, called The Prince of Broadway. He had been working all through the Golden Age, started out working with George Abbott, who was a very famous director, producer, stage doctor, and then Hal Prince followed in his footsteps and did a lot with Sondheim early on. But he was also working early on with some other creators of concept musicals. And I don't want to overlook Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice,
Yes.
who begin they're not only operating in the concept musical space, but they usher in another epic of musical theater history,
Yes.
which is the mega musical.
Yeah, exactly. So this is also the concept musical time is also the time where we see this rise of the super producer or the super director
Yes.
or choreographer, where they really have a lot of clout, but also
Yeah.
are just able to see what's coming next. And I give Hal Prince a lot of credit for that, because I look at him like as a director, I'm like, you're not doing anything that's super directorially crazy.
Right.
you just know what's going to work next.
Yeah. And
Like,
he was
he's a
willing to take a
visionary.
risk. Yeah,
Yeah.
he had been functioning in the golden age space. I mean, he was working with Abbott through the late
Hmm.
30s, early 40s. I mean, like early on. And yet he was willing to say, okay, let's try this thing. Let's try this cabaret. Let's try this company. Let's try Follies. Let's see what will happen, even though it was completely different. He was a lot like Dorothy Fields in that, oh, the form's going to change. Well, I'm going to change with it.
Hmm.
And that's the secret to longevity. And if you're going to be an artist,
Hmm.
is saying, okay, I'm gonna operate in the paradigm that is, you know,
Hmm.
happening at the moment.
And I
Um,
think that that makes a weird shift into the mega musical.
yeah,
What's happening in the 70s, we get the good concept musicals right at the very beginning, where we get, you know, when we get Company and things like that. After that, we get things like, sometimes we get like Oh Calcutta. It's just a lot of naked people on stage, and I'm just like,
they wanted to see how far they could go
yeah,
past
and it's like,
hair, I think. Yeah,
like,
but it did run for a really long
I
time, so
know.
people wanted to
We all
see
go,
that.
okay. So what, like, developmentally, what happens next? Well, you've got kind of this weird concepty musicals that then start to get very mega musical esque. And the two that
Hmm.
I'm talking about are Sweeney Todd and Evita.
Yeah,
And if you talk about Sweeney Todd, where, I mean, it is it is the probably the end, I would say, of the American concept musical, where it's like, I just want to see if I could scare people.
right.
Right? That's what Sondheim says. He goes, I was just trying to scare people, and people are like, "Ooh, that's creepy." Like,
Yeah,
is this
yeah,
cool? But then you've got Evita on the other side, where you have a common man as the narrator of all of this,
yeah,
instead of a like a story. You're having story told from below, like,
yeah,
hugely groundbreaking. We've not seen that before.
right.
Like, those are these huge things. And both of those shows, if you saw the original production of Sweeney Todd, there was not much on stage. It was very angular, very kind of rustic. I mean, it was meant to be that way. It was supposed to be like the absence of the spectacle. You were supposed to
Hmm.
just kind of get into that. So it wasn't like a mega musical like we understand the mega musicals now, like Phantom of the Opera and,
Les Mis and
Les
Miss
Mis and that kind
Saigon
of
and
stuff.
yeah,
But at the same time, it had the mega musical music aspect to it, where you had
yeah,
a whole lot more players in that pit and a whole lot more people with electronic music kind of being part of it. Like, all of that kind of stuff was building up to it. And in Evita, you've got actually more classic music
oh yeah,
than
absolutely.
the other. So they're doing this at the same time. So then what happens? What happens after the 70s? We get to the late 70s, early 80s, and we've got, the Sweeney Todd and the Vita. What happens? What happens is the AIDS crisis.
Yeah,
And we have
right.
to, this is the thing that's going to completely change Broadway, because we go into a point called a place that has been termed by Jessica Sternfeld as the mega musical. And essentially what she says in there, she's like, it's big, dude. They're big. And they are big. And they're very spectacle driven, but they still have their, like, feet dug into kind of the tradition of musical theater. But what I find really interesting during this time is that a good portion of the musicals that we associate with the mega musical are all done by people across the pond.
Hmm.
They're not by Americans, and we have to stop and address what's happening. We know that the AIDS crisis starts to devastate the gay community in New York, of which a good portion of those people are working on Broadway. If you talk to folks who are around there, it was just like, we just lost an entire generation. The
Oh
next
yeah,
generation that was supposed to step up was just wiped out in those 10
including
years.
Michael Bennett, director and
Including,
creator of A Chorus Line and
yes.
Dreamgirls, and you know, he was the next Hal Prince, and
Mm-hmm.
he was taken
Mm-hmm.
because of that. Yeah. And he was far from the only one. There were so many.
And it leaves a gaping hole. And I mean, if you look back at the Tony Awards, like the names that you see over and over and over again, like, I mean, you've got Stephen Sondheim, and he was still with us until just a couple of years ago. But I mean, just people just dying. And I mean, I remember this. I mean, obviously I was alive during this part.
Right.
It's always hard to teach this to young ones and explain that, like, everybody got something from the Surgeon General to their mailbox. And I've now printed it out and handed it to them. It's like, this is how you can get AIDS, and this is how you cannot get AIDS.
Yeah.
Because it was in the blood supply, and everybody knew that. And, you know, we had a family friend whose child had a transfusion and got AIDS from that. And it's just like, okay, so everybody, all of a sudden, this starts touching everything, right? And how people felt about it, and the scare tactics around it as well. But, you know, I look back and I'm like, an entire generation of musical theater artists is gone. And what's the trickle down? Now we're going to see the trickle down very, very clearly in the 90s. But, you know, it really does start showing up, I think, in the 80s, when the only big musicals, they're concentrating everything into a few big shows instead of lots of little shows on Broadway. And, you know, those shows are being marketed well. I mean, they're doing a really great job because all of their eggs are in one basket, and it creates kind of a new way to sell a musical, and move it forward. But most of the creative team is from London. It's Cameron McIntosh.
Right. Cameron McIntosh was the producer on all of those.
Starts with, Cats, and Vita, everything.
Yeah, I had never thought about those two in relationship to each other, but that's really, really interesting. Something I want to mention just very briefly, because I could go for hours and I don't want to. But in the 70s, before we go too deeply afield from there, in the 70s, we also start to see, you know, if you think of theater as a pendulum, and there are norms, and then we swing back, and then we swing back, and then we swing back. We have the norm, and then we shatter it. We react against it and create a new form, as we've seen repeated throughout theater history. Well, in the 70s, we also begin to see people who are those, they would probably consider themselves musical theater purists, who say, wait a minute, company's not a musical. Let's do a real musical. And so we start to see revivals happening.
Oh, yeah.
Revivals of the classics. There's this nostalgia wave, and it also brings us an explosion of musical reviews, particularly musical reviews created by Black creators.
Yes.
So like Bubble and Brown Sugar and Ain't Misbehavin', we see that Raisin was not a musical review, but nevertheless, we see this explosion of Black creators in the 70s that I don't want to blow by, because I think it's really important. And I think it was something like 4 out of the 10 years of Tony Awards, my numbers might be off on that, but it was a number of them, went to Black musicals in the 70s. So I think that's a whole other conversation that we need to have, you know, in a different episode, where we dig into that, because I think it's a really important thing too.
Yep.
But again, so many of those we see, as the form is breaking, we see people wanting to say, but wait a minute, remember this old form? This is what we used to do. Remember that? Wasn't that awesome? And so nostalgia plays a role in that, as we see today, nostalgia playing a role.
Yeah. Well, also, I think nostalgia, it's practicality too. It was like, where are we going to get people to star in this if everybody's dying?
Yeah, good point.
Like, I mean, you know, it's so interconnected, and it's a really kind of,
well, and if you've lost your writers of theater,
you've lost your actors too,
right,
your leading men.
But if we've lost a generation of writers, we can go back and use what's already been written, because we still have the impulse to put on a show. So let's resurrect what's been done.
So then where are we going to find the actors for this? Because this is mostly hitting gay men during this time. What I find interesting more than anything is how the development of the triple threat educationally has changed. And it's because in the 70s, high focus on dance. So much more focus on dance than on The Voice. So there's just not a lot of focus on The Voice. We did not know how to teach the belt at all. Like, I mean, I started collecting, when I was teaching voice, I started collecting kind of vocal pedagogy books. And the ones that come out like right before Annie, where we ruined a generation of girls' voices.
Yes.
I'm just like, oh, glottal, stop.
Everybody wants to sing tomorrow.
Exactly. But, you know, like, it was just not as important as their movement skills, right? Like, it just wasn't. And so that's how we trained them to walk out into that industry. We didn't really worry about, the vocal part of it. It was really more the dance. When we shift and we start going, we need more revivals because we don't have anything new. Revivals. Yeah. That one is not as dance heavy. It is music heavy. And so what happens? So what we start doing is we start grabbing and casting people who've been trained operatically. And so now a huge generation of people who've been like working towards being actors, like, what's the chorus line all about? It's about the dancer's plight, right?
Yeah.
Now we don't need them to dance. No one needs to be able to dance to be in Les Mis. Not one of them. Not one of them.
And not really fan of the opera. I mean, there is a ballet, but it's not, I mean, I could do it.
Yeah, it's not very hard.
No.
But it's just like, okay, so now we're just axing out the other generation of people as we walk into the 80s as well.
Yeah.
And we're starting to pull, I mean, if you look at the careers of like the people that originated Les Mis and stuff, like they're being pulled out of opera.
Yeah, Boublil and Schoenberg, Claude Michel Schoenberg and Alain Boublil.
Yeah, but the actors that are
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
And in turn, because that's what we have there, we start writing more vocally difficult lines. So all of a sudden the education has to drastically change.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I've said this, when I was teaching in a heavy BFA program, I remember telling people, I was like, you need to remember what time your instructor came into the market, because they are going to prepare you for what blindsided them.
Yeah.
And you may be like, this is not important right now. I'm like, yeah, but when you become a teacher, you're going to worry about what's going to blindside you.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, give us some empathy. Like,
right.
Your teacher came out into the world 70s, early 80s, and had all the dance training in the world, and it just was not, all of a sudden, there's no work for it. So what are we going to push at this point, as a teacher? What are the things that we're going to push? So it drastically changes so much, the 80s.
Yeah.
And kind of what we're doing in so many different kind of musical theater worlds.
And I keep bringing up economics, but it also is where we begin to see, now, you're absolutely right that the production costs started going up in the 60s. Like, you can look back and see articles about producers bemoaning the fact that what once cost $60,000 is now costing $2 million, which is still not what it would cost us, even adjusted for inflation, but nevertheless, it was a leap for them. But then you get to the mega musical, that's when we see tens of millions. I mean, like, it just is. So, I mean, imagine you're trying to put a helicopter on a stage or a chandelier that drops 30 feet during the performance and doesn't kill anybody. That is massive. Or a staircase that takes up the whole stage. I mean, these are not inexpensive to produce. And so they really change the economics in a way that we have not recovered from. No. Even though the pendulum has swung back to smaller scale musicals, they're still costing, I mean, $18 million, $12 to $18 million to produce.
And that is small.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
No. And
so
everything kind of blows out of proportion.
Yes.
And it's why, Macintosh can get his foot in the door.
Right.
In many ways. I mean, and he's brilliant. I mean, I tell kids these stories all the time. It's like, okay, so I lived in Los Angeles, so it was the first stop after Broadway.
Yeah.
We'd do a sit-down show in Los Angeles. And for weeks, I was asking my mom, what are these two cat eyes on the billboards?
Oh, gosh.
Because it didn't say cats. It just had the eyes.
Yes.
Or it just had the little waif girl for Les Mis. Or it just had the Phantom Mask. And I'm like, what is this? I mean,
an icon.
Months I was asking, and then it would come out that it's the
marketing.
Broadway musical.
Yeah.
The marketing was brilliant, and we had never done anything like that.
Yes.
We had done some marketing. No. We had gotten it on TV and that kind, but not like this. This was completely different. Completely different way of running things, and that's another reason why it starts costing so much.
Right.
As we move forward. So, in those 80s, we do have 42nd Street, which is its own bear, and we'll talk about that in some time other.
Yeah.
But, Starlight Express, Les Mis,
yes.
Into the Woods we put here too, and Into the Woods actually does very well, and it is not overly spectacular. I mean,
no.
If you look at the spectacle of it, some of it is very rudimentary. If you look at the set and things like that. Compared to what it's up against, which is the Phantom of the Opera. Les Mis and Phantom of the Opera, these are all coming out at the same time.
Right.
And they end up, being tourist attractions for years and years and years.
I mean, Phantom ran for what, 32, 31? Something unimaginable.
Yeah.
Unimaginable. Exactly. 13,000 some odd performances.
Mm-hmm. And so then you move into you cross the threshold of 1990 where we're starting to, as far as the AIDS crisis, we start the I think it's like 95 when the numbers of people dying of AIDS actually start to turn.
Yeah.
But we still have, in 1991, Miss Saigon. Secret Garden comes out, and it is kind of in lots of ways, it feels like the response to the mega musical from the American community. But what I find interesting, written by two women.
Yes, who do not get, those women who wrote that show do not get the love that they deserve to get. They are so overlooked in the pantheon of musical theater writers. I completely agree. But another show,
because it's like there's no men writing new musicals.
Right.
The women have to come out, which is great, but still.
Right. Right. And then we're going to let them fill this gap, but then we're just going to leave them for dead. We're not going to bring them up ever again.
We're not going to do anything.
Really frustrating.
And so then you start seeing this huge change. It's you either get the big mega musical, and really at that point, the only people who have the money at this point to produce them are the Cameron Mackintosh.
Yes.
Really useful company, Cameron Mackintosh.
Which is Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Yeah, Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Is really useful.
And Cameron Mackintosh, and enter Disney. We'll get Disney here in about a year and a half.
Yes,
everything
94.
Else, and I want to point this out. Everything else is there are things that are they are flash in the pan kind of musicals. Yeah. Revivals do okay, but you get these new type of musicals, dance musicals, jukebox musicals, movie musicals. All of a sudden, people are throwing stuff against the wall to get something new and American.
Yes.
And it's not sticking. Now, jukebox musicals are gonna start working in a few years. But what I want to make sure that we point out is when you have a generation of artists and they all die at once, there is no one to teach new people how to do this.
That's a great point.
And so one time with my 19, I don't know. It was a couple years ago at a musical theater history class. I gave them all groups, and I'm like, I just want you to do 1993, 1994, 1992, or whatever. Write down every musical that opens. We had something like 700 musicals, and most of them you've never heard of before.
Oh my gosh.
And they would open and close and open and close and open and close and open and close. They were all like jukebox musicals that you've never heard of.
Right.
And the class was like, and I thought it would be a great exercise, but because I had never done it.
Yeah, right. That is a good exercise.
I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to do this all the time. We don't always have time to do it, but it illustrates so quickly how, so many people are trying to be, Broadway writers, and like, they're just throwing things at the wall. They don't know how to do it. There's no one to mentor them. There's no one to it's where the necessity of jukebox musicals and movie musicals and all these things come from, because there's no one to teach them how to do it like they did it before in the tradition. And That's what happens when you have a mass casualty event.
Well, in addition to that, and your point is very well taken, but in addition to that, you've not only got a lack of creators and a lack of mentors, but you've also got an explosion of production costs. And so we can't put an untested story on the stage for $15 million. Yeah. Right? Because look at what happened with Cape Man, the 1998 Paul Simon musical, which I think was like, at the time, it was the most, I think it was 11 million. It was the biggest flop in Broadway history. And it was a original musical with original music, not jukebox musical, written by Paul Simon. Massive flop. Producers were suddenly not going to put up that much money for a show or for a story that people were not familiar with, which is why movie adaptations and jukebox musicals are so successful. But also a musical that I think often gets overlooked that does a couple of things that are relevant to this conversation here. One is, the musical is Crazy for You, 1992. Yes. And it was produced by a theater outsider who'd met George Gershwin when he was 5 years old and grew up loving his music. And he made a ton of money in the catalog business and decided what he was going to do with it was revive a Gershwin musical. Now, part of it was nostalgia, right? Part of it was we're sick of our British overlords holding sway over what has always been the great American cultural product, which is the musical theater as we know it, right? In terms of the modern American musical, we think of it. And he was going to seize that back. But, and that's what the reviews became were finally, Frank Rich wrote in the New York Times, finally, historians will look back at the time when Americans took back control of the creation of the musical. And it was Crazy for You in 1992. Now, Crazy for You won the Tony Award in 1992 for Best Musical. But also, it was a jukebox musical, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. And a lot of people want to point to Mamma Mia as the first ever jukebox musical, and that is not true. Exactly, there's
hundreds before that one actually works.
Mamma Mia caused everybody to want to say, "Hey, wait a minute! I've written a lot of songs. Could I turn it into $2 billion like ABBA did?" But there were it was happening all the time where we're pulling. Crazy for You was a perfect example where they just picked their favorite Gershwin songs, whether or not they were from the same show or not, and made the new Gershwin musical. And in fact, that was done again in 2012 with Nice Work If You Can Get It, using Gershwin music with a completely different story. So Crazy for You was the Americans thought we've done it now, or at least those commentating on theater at the time thought Americans have back the theater. But also it's an example of the jukebox musical was here long before Mamma Mia in 2001. Well, 1999 in London, but 2001 on Broadway.
There are so many jukebox musicals in the 90s. We went through and counted, and it was all jukebox musicals. It was all this stuff that I'm like, oh my gosh, I always wanted to see that, but it only lasted 2 minutes.
Yeah, just right.
A small point about Crazy for You that I think is amazing when histories come together. The star of Crazy for You,
Jodie Benson.
Ariel, the Little Mermaid.
That's right.
So not only that, Little Mermaid is credited, even in the 90s, early 90s, everybody said The Little Mermaid brought back Disney. It brought back that nostalgia, back to greater things. So they say the same thing about Disney film.
And Jodie Benson was a part of both of them.
Jodie Benson is that linchpin in.
That's right.
That's right. Lives near me. She's apparently very, very nice.
Oh, I followed her on Instagram. I never thought about you living in but yes, because so many of the students that I taught when I taught your class were friends with her daughter in high school.
Exactly. All of my students were friends with her daughter, and they all went to different, so. Yep,
that's right. That's exactly right. But that's a great point. So the Little Mermaid film was 89, I believe. And then Crazy for You was 92. And it's true. Little Mermaid was not on Broadway in the 90s, but all of a sudden, Disney, whose film business had fallen way off, they had a massive success with Little Mermaid. They decided, let's keep doing this. And their next big one was Beauty and the Beast, which then
brings us to 1994.
Disney on Broadway.
Where we get, So in 1994, or 1993 and 94, they actually purchased the New Amsterdam Theater from the city of New York. And in doing so, they create a space that only they can work in. It's only been Disney musicals in there since that point.
That's right.
And they using their own kind of Disney magic, the way that they work or whatever.
Yeah,
and
Imagineers or whatever they're called.
Exactly. And then they put Beauty and the Beast on stage, and it is a massive hit. Yeah. Massive hit. The second one that they put on stage is The Lion King, which is still running and will run. They've taken it out of the New Amsterdam, put it in another theater because they're like, it's going to run forever.
Yeah. If we want to do anything else, we better rearrange.
And the thing is that it's like a lot of times, and I did this on the timeline that we'll put on the website, that I kind of differentiate in 1994. I feel like we have to say this is Disney's coming in, but it's still a mega musical.
Yeah. Oh, no question. No question. Absolutely.
It's still a mega musical. It's
you don't expect Disney to come in and be demure, right?
No, but I mean, we're dominated by
big, flashy.
Well, it's the spectacle level mega musical, but I mean, it's still all of their, all of their little animated features, they're just little musicals. Mm-hmm. They're little, and they're built almost on the same, almost on the same formula. Like, mm-hmm. I mean, it's the same thing. It's just, it's geared a little different to a different maybe audience. And, and then they fluff them up a little bit to put them on Broadway and do to a wider audience, mm-hmm. like it's just a different kind of pointing of your audience focus, but they're just musicals, the movies the animated movies that they're making. Some of them are better than others, which we know.
No doubt.
Anyway, so that's where we are in the 90s. Just a lot of things being thrown at the wall. The other thing that we see is kind of just all of these, something I call attack of the hybrids. In 1996 to 2000, we start having people who have a little bit more experience, and are making some musicals that actually continue to show up later on, not just Phantom and Les Mis, etc. and so on. So it's between 1996 and 2000 that we get The Scarlet Pimpernel, that we get Ragtime, that we get The Lion King, that we get Jekyll and Hyde, we get Rent, we get Bring In Noise, Bring In Funk, Titanic, Steel Pier, Sideshow, Saturday Night Fever, Swing, Fosse, Parade, Big, the musical, Floyd Collins. Those are we're starting to kind of find our feet, but nothing is so big that it kind of moves us into something else. It's one of those transitional times I find a lot of. I graduated from high school in 1996, and knew I loved musical theater and all of that, and just knew there was nothing on Broadway until I graduated. Like, there was just nothing that I could see other than Phantom and stuff. And so all of a sudden, all this new stuff, and they were pitched different and pointed different. The hybrid musicals that are like Fosse is mostly dance, less on the story, and whereas and Swing is the same way. Whereas then you've got Ragtime and Scarlet Pimpernel and Steel Pier that are more classically inclined. But then you've got the movie musical aspect of it that's more about the story. They're not really integrated yet. They're not fully put back together. But there's certainly, I don't think that the form is dying anymore, kind of a thing. Because for a long time there, I mean, I remember the 90s were kind of bleak and kind of scary. Like, is this all that's going to happen? So it's, once we get out of that, we start getting some more more integrated forms. We start getting, we get Aida. That's Disney again.
Another Disney,
Mamma Mia shows up. Urinetown, the producers, again, very hybrid-esque and everything. We also get 9/11, which really sets us back a couple years. I think this would have happened a lot
And drives us back like the Depression did to a need for escapism. I mean, I think that
Exactly.
was one of the things that set Mamma Mia up for its explosion of success in the US
Exactly.
was the timing of its opening. It opened in October of 2001,
Hmm.
and in fact, members of the creative team were like, "What do we do? Do we open? What do we
Do we
do?"
not open? Yeah.
And Giuliani, who was mayor of New York at the time, begged them, please, we need people. You probably saw the ad
Yep.
campaign with Bernadette Peters and Nathan
I
Lane begging
love New
everybody,
York.
yes, come to New York, all that. And so part of that was, please, Mamma Mia, open. And so Mamma Mia opens a month after September
Hmm.
11th, and it explodes, which is probably the very worst term to say, but it's very, very
Yeah.
popular. I mean, it was just a mega success
And we
because
get
it was
Thoroughly
so
Mama Millie
fun. Yeah.
and
Oh my gosh, I
Hairspray
love
the
that show.
next
Yeah.
year.
Yeah. So it definitely that need for escapism remains
Hmm.
for a number of years, as it did after the stock market crash in 1929.
And what's interesting though is that we don't go. I My kids always laugh at me because I always say history is cyclical. We just keep doing the same things over and over and over again. But unlike when the stock market crashes and then we go through 10 years of just like not a lot going on, and then boom, we get Oklahoma.
Oklahoma.
What happens after 2001 is that we get a lot of really kind of well constructed hybrid musicals, and a lot of kind of what I call the neoclassic musicals starting to kind of pop up and actually be viable and then explode. So it's in
Hmm.
2003 when we get Wicked.
Yeah.
And we know, the impact of Wicked. We just had
Yeah.
the first half come out in film in December, and it's just Wicked came out, and I remember thinking to myself, I love this musical. It makes me feel like this is the next Oklahoma.
Hmm.
Um, I was like, I love this musical so much that I know it's gonna
Go
close.
away.
Like it's
Go
gonna close in
quietly
two
into the
minutes.
dark.
And
Right.
I'm like, so I'm gonna be the cool musical theater historian,
Who
and I'm
knows
gonna
all
name my
about it?
dog Elphaba. So I had a dog named Elphaba in 2003. Um, and then it becomes this wild like thing, and everybody's like, your dog is named Elphaba, and I'm like, look,
That's so
I
cliche.
didn't. Yeah, and I was like, look, I didn't
I
know.
was there first.
She's been around for a long time, guys. Um, Elphaba the dog was special. She was very, very cool. But I really think something different happens when we hit Wicked. We go into kind of a new neoclassic time, where we also get Avenue Q, but then listen to this litany of shows that happen right after that: Spamalot, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, Light in the Piazza, Color Purple, Spelling Bee, Jersey Boys, Drowsy Chaperone, which we both love, I think.
My favorite.
Yeah, Spring Awakening, Mary Poppins, Tarzan, Little Women, Crybaby, Xanadu, Little Mermaid, Young Frankenstein, Shrek the Musical, 9 to 5, Next to Normal, Million Dollar Quartet. And we're just now getting to 2010 with
2010, yeah.
American Idiot, Addams Family, Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson. Big musicals.
Yes.
And here's the reason we're going to stop here, basically. We're 20 years out from when these guys opened. I think everybody knew at the moment when when Avenue Q won the Tony over Wicked, and everybody said it
Hmm.
was because literally everyone was like, well, Wicked's going to win. Let's cast a vote for this nice. So they
Let's
don't
throw him
have
a
zero.
bone.
Yeah, but literally the Tony Award, like the people who voted were like, I did not see that coming. Like they just didn't see it coming. Like nobody saw it coming. And I don't think Avenue Q is a bad musical necessarily.
Right.
But everybody was. It was the biggest upset in Broadway history,
Yes.
right? That
Yes.
Wicked didn't win. It still look back and go, what just happened there?
Yeah.
I think everybody knew something different was happening. But I feel like we're coming around full circle again, and we're having an Oklahoma moment, and we're creating these kind of neo-classic musicals, kind of like the neoclassic age.
Yeah.
And in theater history and in art and that kind of stuff, where we're going back to the good stuff that we had before,
What worked before.
what worked
Yeah.
before, and obviously adding the new to it. These don't, you can't put Oklahoma and Wicked next to one another and say, oh my gosh, they're so similar, because they're not.
Right.
In many ways. Structurally, they're very similar. You
Mm-hmm.
know, how they market themselves, they're very similar. But it's like we've come around full circle. And where do we go next? I don't know. I think there's a lot of evidence for in 2015 where we get something like Hamilton, where, Hamilton's going to end up on that timeline.
Yeah.
And whether that's social discussion or social protest or whatever, if we're moving into something else, I'm really interested to see where it's going, and what's next. But it's just too soon. Like, it's too soon to make too many judgments about it.
Right.
Kids, students will know that in my classroom, I'm like, here's what I think is going to happen. I'll tell you what I think I'm going to happen. But I'm not,
but that doesn't mean it's going to happen.
It doesn't mean it's going to happen, number one. And number two, it's not something I'm going to commit to the written word. This is something I'm going to say in the privacy of my classroom. Right?
Right.
I mean, like, this is where I think we're going. Because I don't know. And, I do think that history does give us a pattern and tells us, I wish we would learn a lot more from history, because I don't know that we do that very well, because humans are just the same people all the way through history. We do not learn from our mistakes, whatever that is. And so looking at this, and I'm like, so are we going to do the same thing that we did in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and then have to have a rebirth again? Or are we going to make something new out of this? How is it going to grow, and how is it going to change?
And I'm trying to think of how we could, and this shows you that I'm not a creator of musical theater, because when you say make something new, I'm like, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Like, I can't even envision. I'm sure someone can think that far out of the box, but it ain't me.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fun to watch. It's super fun to watch kind of what they're going to come up with next, but it's sitting back and hoping, because honestly, we're the first generation of musical theater scholars. Like
no question.
People that did the PhDs specifically for musical theater, they were not allowing people to do that beforehand.
That's exactly right.
And because of that, nobody had really, because there's so many of us now.
And that's why we were told The Black Crook was the first American musical, because there was no scholarship.
No.
Before.
And so we're having to go back and keep doing the scholarship and keep uncovering new things. But I wonder how different this is going to be, because creators and students have access to kind of the history of the past.
Right.
My hope would be that they would learn from what happened, after Oklahoma and before Oklahoma, and they would learn how to continue to keep this an American art form, and something that still holds that mirror up to American society, because gosh, musical theater is it. That's what we have to offer. It's our thing.
Right. Right.
How do we keep it our thing and keep it growing and changing? So.
Well, and I think that the good news is, if you look at, and I'm pulling it up right now, let's see if I can find it. If you look at ticket sales, right? Ticket sales are robust. Broadway's doing very, very well.
And they're charging over $100 a ticket.
Right. And they're selling them. Now, shows are not running long term. That's not good in terms of return on investment for producers. But people are nevertheless going to Broadway. And if they're not going to Broadway in New York, they're going by the boatload around the country.
They are.
National touring houses are sold out for, it doesn't matter what, it is sold out. So I think the fact that there is such a robust interest in attending theater, most Broadway series across the country are, if not 100% musicals, 98.7% musicals. So I think the fact that there is so much consumer interest in seeing Broadway shows, whether it's in New York or around the country, bodes well for, continuity of creation. What that looks like, as we've been discussing, remains to be seen, however.
Yeah. And my hope is that it's not kind of a fluke of the after pandemic.
Could
kind
be.
of mindset.
And it could be a Hamilton effect. Everybody wanted to see Hamilton, so they all bought subscriptions to.
Yeah.
But Hamilton's been on the road since what, 16 or 17,
16.
and it's ongoing. So I'm hopeful that it will continue to be the norm. Initially, it looked like it was a Hamilton anomaly, but the fact that it's continued gives me hope that it's just people want to go see these shows, and that's great. And so long as there is a demand, creators and producers will find a way to supply something.
Yeah. And the other thing that we're finding, and one of the reasons I think, I wanted to do this was because what's touring right now, not necessarily what's in regional houses or anything else, that's what people want to go see. They want to be part of the big audiences, and they want to be part of that large scale kind of experience, and that makes people feel, I think, safe right now. So that is where we are. So those are our timelines, and we'll probably do some era episodes here, there, and everywhere. But we're gonna start. I think at this point we're kind of gonna change gears and start talking about what's on tour right now, and do episodes on that, so that if you're actually one of those people who are, have those season tickets, you can listen to that episode and have a little bit of a modicum of knowing what you're about to go see. Because we all know that that's really hard sometimes to walk in and be like, I have no idea what we're watching.
Right.
What am I going to get out of this? Is this really worth my time? And it will be worth your time.
Right. And that's where the tagline, educating theatergoers, enhancing theatergoing, comes in, is because truly it is our belief that the more you know about a show, the more you can enjoy it when you go to see it. So what that will look like as we look at these shows that are on tour will be deep dives into the development of these shows and into their creators. And hopefully we can keep those in a real manageable time frame, which it might surprise you to find out is hard for Tracey and I.
I don't know why.
Because we both have a lot to say, but nevertheless, that's what's upcoming. So I hope that you will tune in for that. And I thank you for joining us for these 2 timeline episodes. Thank you, Tracey. I know I have learned a lot, so I appreciate you giving some context and connecting some dots I had never connected in my own mind. So thank you for that. That'll do it for this episode of the Dr. Broadway podcast. Tune in next time when we'll be, as we alluded to, deep diving into some of the great shows that are touring around the country right now, coming soon to a city near you. Until then, connect with us via email at hello@drbroadway.com or on Instagram or TikTok at Dr. Bway Podcast.